I still remember that morning with almost painful clarity, as if the memory itself refuses to soften. The sun had barely crested the horizon, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the small kitchen I had just finished tidying. I had made plans to surprise my family. I wanted to tell them I had finally been promoted at work, that after months of late nights and endless revisions, my effort had been recognized. But life, I realized, sometimes has a cruel sense of timing. By the time I arrived at the family home, the air was heavy with laughter. My parents, my older sister, even my youngest cousin were crowded around the breakfast table, phones in hand, murmuring and giggling in that way people do when they are sharing a private joke. No, I wasn't part of. I had barely stepped through the doorway when the words hit me like shards of glass. "You lost your job," my sister said, barely concealing her grin. I froze, unsure if I'd heard correctly. My voice, small and wavering, tried to explain. "It's just a temporary setback. I have interviews lined up, but she cut me off. "Come on, don't pretend. We all know you'll be crawling back soon. You can't even handle a little failure without losing it." Laughter erupted around the table. My mother nodded, almost proudly, and my father gave that condescending smile he always wore when he thought he was being honest, but was really being cruel. They weren't mad, they were entertained. And in that moment, I realized the person I thought my family was didn't exist anymore. Or maybe they never had. I tried to laugh with them, a hollow sound that barely passed my lips, but inside, something in me cracked. The warmth I had always associated with family, the safe harbor, the unconditional support vanished in the space of a single sentence. I wanted to shout, to beg them to understand, to remind them that I was still their daughter, still their sister. But instead, I did what I had learned to do early in life. I swallowed the words, folded my hurt into a small, quiet package, and left. The drive back to my apartment was silent, except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sigh that escaped my chest without permission. I replayed the morning over and over in my mind. Their laughter echoed in every corner, their smug certainty that I would fail a prophecy I hadn't even accepted yet. My heart ached not because I had lost my job, but because I realized my own family. The people I had trusted to love me without conditions found joy in my misfortune. For days afterward, I stayed home, enveloped in a quiet that felt both suffocating and strangely liberating. No calls, no messages, no check-ins, just the empty apartment and the stillness that allowed me to hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time in years. I cried quietly at night, yes, but I also began to notice something that would later grow into a steady ember of strength. I could survive this. I could survive even if they couldn't cheer me on, even if their love was conditional, even if they were gone from the part of my life where I needed them most. I started small, polishing my resume, sending emails, scheduling interviews. Every rejection was a small sting, but each one reminded me of my own resilience. I kept the apartment tidy, cooked my meals with care, and slowly learned that silence could be a teacher. It taught me to listen to my own voice, to pay attention to the quiet whispers of intuition I had long ignored for the sake of pleasing others. But the hardest lesson wasn't the job loss. It was the realization that the people you expect to protect you, the ones who should be the first to hold your hand when the world turns cruel, could also be the ones who turn away. That laughter, which had felt like an assault in the morning sunlight, became a mirror showing me who they truly were, and more importantly, who I was not willing to become. That night, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I whispered to myself something I hadn't said aloud in years. I deserve better than this. And in that quiet, bitter, almost sacred moment, I made a promise not to anyone else, but to myself. No matter how long it took, no matter how invisible I felt in that family's eyes, I would rise. I would rebuild. Not to prove them wrong, not for the drama, not for the satisfaction, but for the quiet dignity that comes from knowing your own worth, even when those closest to you cannot. And so, with nothing but a small apartment, a quiet heart, and a determination that surprised even me, my real journey began. This sets the emotional hook, the betrayal, and the quiet turning point for her growth. It's calm, realistic, and sets up her slow transformation toward wisdom and self-respect. If you want, I can continue chapter 2 next, where we slowly explore her rebuilding, the pain of silence, and the subtle observation of who truly cares, keeping the emotional tension growing. Do you want me to continue with chapter 2 now? The first few months after that morning felt like walking through a fog. My family's laughter still haunted me, echoing in the spaces where love and trust should have lived. But as the initial sting dulled, I noticed something unexpected, a kind of freedom in their absence. I didn't have to anticipate their judgment, their teasing, their dismissive smirks. I could exist in my own pace, in my own space, without performing for their approval. At first, it was lonely. I would scroll through my phone and stop at pictures of family gatherings, wondering if they had talked about me, if they even missed me, if they cared at all. The silence was deafening. There were no calls, no messages, no invitations. It was a vacuum, a quiet reminder that my life had shifted, and they weren't a part of it anymore. But slowly, as the weeks turned into months, that silence began to feel different. It became a teacher. I started noticing things I had never truly paid attention to. The calm rhythm of my own mornings, the small victories in finishing a project for a potential employer, the way a quiet apartment could become a sanctuary rather than a reminder of absence. I learned to listen to my own thoughts without filtering them, to hear my own voice instead of theirs. I began taking small steps forward, resumes polished, emails sent, applications submitted. Every rejection stung like a dull knife, but instead of turning to them for reassurance, I turned inward. I discovered a quiet strength in self-reliance, a subtle courage in facing the world alone. I learned that resilience wasn't about loud declarations or dramatic victories. It was about showing up for yourself day after day when no one else would. And as I rebuilt my life, I started observing my family from afar. Social media gave me glimpses, a new car here, a vacation there, birthday parties with friends I barely recognized. I noticed patterns, subtle truths hidden beneath their cheerful facades. My parents, I realized, were always performing for an audience, valuing appearances over substance. My sister thrived on admiration and validation, oblivious to the feelings of those around her. It hurt, yes, but it also clarified something vital. Their approval was never truly mine to seek. The people I had loved and trusted had their own priorities, their own values, and they didn't include me. And that, as painful as it was to admit, freed me. I began creating boundaries, soft, invisible walls that protected my emotional energy. I stopped calling to check if they missed me. I stopped offering explanations or apologies for my life choices. Silence became a shield, not a prison. One evening, I sat by the window, sketchbook in hand, and wrote down every emotion I had buried during those first devastating days. Anger, sadness, disappointment, longing, they all spilled onto the page, raw and unedited, and for the first time I didn't feel ashamed of them. I didn't feel small or weak. I felt alive. I felt like someone learning the art of being whole on her own terms. I also began noticing small acts of kindness from unexpected places, a former colleague checking in, a neighbor offering help with groceries, even strangers at interviews who treated me with respect and patience. These gestures, small and unremarkable in isolation, accumulated into a quiet reassurance. I wasn't defined by my family's laughter or their neglect. There were people who saw me, who valued me, and I could build a life around those connections. The most profound change, though, was internal. I no longer sought revenge or validation from my family. Their laughter had lost its power over me. When their names came up, I could think of them without the sharp sting of betrayal. I could remember their faces without flinching. And I understood, in a deep, unshakable way, that my worth had nothing to do with their approval. 3 years passed like this, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. I moved into a new apartment, signed my first independent lease, and saved steadily. My career began to take shape, slowly but surely. I learned to trust my own judgment, to make decisions grounded in logic and self-respect rather than fear or desperation. The girl who had left my family's house that morning, shattered and humiliated, had transformed into someone calm, wise, and emotionally strong. And yet, in the quiet moments, I still wondered, would they notice? Would they regret? I didn't need the answers. Silence had taught me the greatest lesson. Life delivers consequences naturally, without spectacle, and dignity doesn't need applause to exist. I was building a life anchored in quiet strength, and that was enough. 3 years had passed since the morning they laughed at me. 3 years of quiet work, small victories, and patient rebuilding. I had learned to value silence over drama, prudence over impulse, and dignity over spectacle. But life, as it often does, had a way of presenting opportunities just when you least expect them, and usually when you're ready to meet them with calm rather than desperation. It started with an email. The subject line was innocuous, almost mundane. Property available in your area. I almost deleted it. I had been saving steadily and methodically to one day buy a home, my own place, free from judgment, free from prying eyes, but this email carried something different. A modest property in the neighborhood where my family lived had come on the market. I paused, fingers hovering over the mouse. Memories of their laughter, their dismissive tones, the way they had all assumed I'd never recover, flashed through my mind. For a brief moment, I considered turning away. This wasn't about them. This was about me, but instinct nudged me to click. The property was perfect for what I envisioned, not lavish, not showy, just stable, quiet, and dignified. It had been listed for months, and the previous owner, a distant relative of someone I barely knew, was eager to sell. The paperwork was straightforward, and the mortgage approval I had been cultivating for years made the process seamless. In a week, I was signing the final documents, holding keys that unlocked not just a house, but a space where I could finally breathe without their shadow hovering over me. Yet even as I celebrated this milestone, I couldn't ignore the subtle thrill of awareness that this house, this street, this neighborhood was the same one my family inhabited. Not by design, at least not at first glance. They had never known I was capable of purchasing property of my own. But the thought that one day I might walk into their lives in a way they hadn't anticipated, a way built quietly over years of effort, was not lost on me. Life continued at its steady pace, work demanding but manageable, and evenings spent furnishing the new apartment with careful attention to detail. I rarely thought about my family, not because the old hurt had vanished, but because it no longer had the power to control my emotions. They existed in my life only in memory and observation, and I found a strange satisfaction in that distance. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. It was a notice about a minor property boundary dispute. Someone had assumed incorrectly that the property was still available. My pulse quickened not for confrontation, but because it required a signature, a presence, a decision. I went to the office, calmly explained the situation, signed the necessary papers, and walked away. No dramatics, no declarations, just quiet authority. I had learned that control doesn't scream, it settles quietly, firmly, like roots in the soil. It was during those days of quiet diligence that I began to notice subtle changes on social media. Photos of my parents' house, posts about family gatherings, birthday parties they hadn't changed, but I had. I observed their laughter, their casual boasts, the same old patterns, through the lens of someone who had reclaimed her own life. I realized that while they were still performing for the world, for appearances, I had built a life grounded in substance, in self-respect, in authenticity. And then came the first real test of patience. I received a message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. The tone was polite, even warm, but faintly inquisitive. "Congratulations on the new place," it said. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just a quiet acknowledgement. I didn't respond immediately. I let the message sit in my inbox for a day, savoring the stillness, the power of choosing my timing. This was a world where I no longer reacted out of fear or neediness. I responded on my own terms, with calm and grace, not with anger or vindication. By the end of those weeks, the house felt fully mine not because of the keys, the walls, or the furniture, but because it represented years of endurance, observation, and quiet fortitude. I had built a life without them, grown stronger without them, and learned that dignity doesn't need validation from anyone else. I knew deep down that eventually they would notice. They would see the independence, the calm competence, the quiet success. And when they did, I would not be angry. I would not seek revenge. I would only observe, with the same quiet patience that had carried me this far, knowing that life delivers its own justice when boundaries are clear and self-respect is intact. The house wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a prize to show them up. It was proof, to myself above all, that I could thrive on my own terms. And in that proof, I found a peace that laughter could never break. The day I decided to walk into my family's house as their landlord, my hands felt steady, my mind calm. There was no thrill of revenge, no simmering anger, only the quiet strength of someone who had rebuilt her life from scratch. The laughter that once haunted me was just a memory now, a faint echo that had lost its power. I parked my car on the street, taking a moment to breathe in the familiar neighborhood air. The houses looked the same, the trees still swayed lazily in the breeze, and the sun reflected off windows just like it had 3 years ago. But everything had changed, not the world around me, but me. I had grown into someone calm, measured, and wise. The person who had left that morning, humiliated and broken, would scarcely recognize her own reflection. I carried the folder of property papers in my hand, a symbol, yes, but more importantly, a reminder of every quiet hour, every rejection endured, every small victory accumulated over the years. I rang the doorbell and waited. When the door opened, my mother's face lit up in surprise, quickly followed by a flicker of confusion. My father and sister appeared behind her, their smiles faltering as they registered my presence. I said nothing immediately. I let the silence settle, letting it speak for me. Silence, I had learned, often says more than words. "My name is," I began, voice calm and even. "I believe you've received notice of the house purchase." My mother blinked, glanced at the papers in my hand, and then back at me. "Oh, you bought the house," she stammered, a tone of disbelief creeping into her voice. My sister frowned, the corners of her mouth twitching. My father simply raised an eyebrow, as if trying to process the reality before him. "Yes," I replied, carefully watching their expressions. "I am now the owner of this property. Your lease begins next month." The room went quiet again. Not tense, not angry, just the kind of quiet that carries the weight of realization. For years, they had assumed I would fail, assumed I would beg, assumed that their approval defined my worth. But that assumption had been wrong. I had worked quietly, persistently, without seeking validation, and now I stood here, calm, composed in the space they had once thought I could never occupy. Then my phone buzzed, one notification after another. 44 missed calls from my mother. Messages flooded in. Call us immediately. We need to talk. We didn't know you could. I did not move to answer immediately. I let the phone rest in my pocket. I had already read their faces. I had already observed the truth. The calls, the messages, the frantic attempts to regain connection, they were just noise. I didn't need to react. I took a slow breath and said, softly, almost as if I were speaking to myself, I hope you enjoy the house. I trust we can maintain a respectful arrangement. There was no malice in my tone, only clarity. Boundaries were being drawn, but quietly, intelligently, with dignity intact. My mother opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to plead, but I shook my head slightly. Everything else, I continued, is between us as it always has been. I have nothing to say that can undo the past, but I can promise that I will act with fairness and respect, and I expect the same. In that moment, something shifted. I saw the subtle recognition on their faces, not just that I had succeeded, but that I had changed. That the girl they had underestimated, mocked, and dismissed had grown into someone they could no longer define, control, or diminish. The power had always been mine, quietly nurtured over years of self-respect and perseverance. I turned gently and walked away. The door closed softly behind me, and I felt a sense of release that no loud confrontation could ever have given me. The phone buzzed again. Still 44 missed calls, but I didn't look. I didn't need to. I had already claimed what mattered most, my dignity, my boundaries, my peace. Walking back to my car, the sun warmed my face, and I realized how far I had come. I had survived betrayal. I had endured laughter turned cruel. I had rebuilt my life quietly, without needing anyone to validate me. And now, finally, I felt that deep, unshakable satisfaction. The satisfaction of knowing that true emotional justice isn't loud, isn't dramatic. It is lived silently, fully, and wisely. And as I drove home, I understood the most important lesson of all. Respect cannot be demanded, it can only be earned. And the first person who must earn it is yourself.